A Sumid Song by Swifto. On a planet far, far away, there lived a race of beings called the Sumids. The Sumids were a funny little race of beings, with big keen eyes and odd patches of fur on their heads and around their beaks. They were a mostly quiet and peaceful race who dwelt in their native planet heavily wooded areas. They were shy and suspicious of other races. A few of them were capable of being quite curious of other worlds beyond their own, but those who were rare among the Sumids. Most preferred not to involve themselves in the affairs of other races, and were only interested in the Sumid world, as they saw it, the most important world in the galaxy. They busied themselves with their favourite pastimes of eating, fighting, and making things. But the thing that the Sumids enjoyed most of all was to sing. They loved the sound of their own voices, and would happily sing all day long and long into the night. Their songs were full of fun and frolics, or of love and sex, or of hard labours and happy hearts, and a love for the beautiful forest world around them. They had a song for every occasion, from birth till death. They had a song for all steps and side paths of life. Singing songs was a huge part of the Sumid courtship rituals, and those who could not sing well were destined to a sad and lonely life. Singing was the most important skill, and above all others, the Sumids considered it the most valuable. But not all Sumids regarded singing as the most important thing in life. There was once a young Sumid boy called Siow, who thought that there must have been more to life than simply wandering the forests and singing all day long. He had heard songs of odd people who came from other planets, big, fearsome warrior people, and people who could travel in huge machines, at great speeds across the sky. In their worlds there existed people who never sung any songs, but yet could tell the most extraordinary stories, simply by talking about them. The idea of verbally communicating a story through simple words and not by song confused most Sumids. Those who could understand the concept just simply thought it to be a dull and primitive form of communication, not worth singing about. The Sumid children were far more curious about such things than the adults were, and they often liked to share songs about the other worlds that travellers told them about before they grew up and were taught to abandon their imaginations. One of these songs which Siow found particularly funny was that of a strange little backward planet where the people on it apparently valued useless gemstones, metals and bits of plastic far more than their actual people. These odd little people also worshipped a strange god known as the economy, and believed that the destinies of their peoples were dictated by the will of the economy. Siow had lofty dreams of getting off this dreary planet and out into the stars to find other, new and exciting peoples, and learn of this strange concept of hearing stories spoken rather than sung. It fascinated him to hear that such stories could also be learned from looking at strange symbols, which the aliens called letters. The Sumids had no letters. They were far too busy with more important things, like fighting and singing tales of fighting. Siow dreamed of visiting these strange alien worlds, where stories were recorded in symbols and people stayed in one place, in dwellings far from any trees. But his elders told him that he was a silly boy for having such dreams, and that he should focus on real-life matters if he wanted to grow up into a real Suman. He was told that he should dream more of important tasks, like becoming a competitive fighter or weaver of baskets, rather than having silly, impossible notions of being a space adventurer. They sung him songs of the importance of the forest, and how great Sumids and their way of life was, and of songs that told them that they should be grateful for their wonderful lush green world which they called home. But Siow was sick of hearing how great everything was. He was sick and tired of all the constant songs about this and that, and never of any daring adventures by any Sumid explorers. All the songs relating to people from other planets were always warnings of how dangerous they could be, of how they were so strange and untrustworthy. They were always one-sided and represented the Sumids as the good, honest victims of evil aliens who came only to cause chaos. But Siow was certain that they couldn't all be evil, and when he looked at his own race of people and how they spent their time fighting and plotting against each other, each clan claiming to be the best and singing a myriad of songs about how they were the best Sumids, he couldn't help feel alienated and disillusioned with their way of life. Though they did like to fight, the Sumids were a mostly peaceful race, and their fighting never got truly serious. They were constantly singing about how their clan was better than all others, and how their patch of the forest was richer and greener than all others. Their songs went on in an extremely repetitive manner about the same old things, over and over, to the point that Siow started to hate all songs. This only made him grow more distant towards his fellow Sumids, and they began to worry about him. His brothers and cousins thought there was something very wrong in his head and called him stupid. He had no friends, and all the other children called him a freak and made up songs about what an odd little monster he was. His big brother, Adieu, said that he must have been an alien monster from one of the other planets that he was so fond of, and that he should just fly back there to his own strange people. And so, as a bit of an outcast, Siow wandered the children's forest alone, hoping that no one would bother him, hoping they would leave him to his own quiet thoughts of adventure beyond the dullness of the forests. Occasionally others would see him wandering alone and take pity on him. They offered to let him join in with their singing and try to show him kindness. But Siow had no love for singing and refused to join in, though he was desperately alone. In time the others just accepted that Siow wanted to be alone and left him to wander. For a time this suited Siow just fine. He was very lonely, but he had no interest in singing, so he was glad whenever he could find a quiet spot far away from the others, as he could be alone with his thoughts and not hear another repetitive patriotic Sumid song of how one corner of the forest was somehow more green and lovely than some other corner of the forest. But Siow's real suffering came a few seasons later, when he went through the Sumid transition period from being a child into an adult. All of a sudden his body began to change. He found his loneliness becoming deeper and darker, and it seemed to swallow him up in an empty void of utter despair. He now found being alone not merely upsetting, but heart-wrenchingly painful, as his hormones forced him to desire companionship. As he became an adult, he found himself longing for the sweet, soft sound of a young Sumid girl's voice. For the first time in his life, he, like all other Sumids, craved singing. But more than that, he desperately wanted to find a female partner to sing with. Now that he was an adult, he desired more than anything to hear sweet feminine song. The other young Sumids of Siow's age began their courtship singing and found their partners. Siow was eager to try a courtship song of his own, but in years of solitude he had quite forgotten how to sing well and was afraid to sing and make a fool of himself, for he felt that if he did, his chances for love would be ruined forever. He felt he was not quite ready yet and went off deep into the forest to practice his singing before he could feel ready to begin courting a girl. In the meantime, his brothers and cousins and all his fellow young Sumids of the children's forest sang their hearts out and eventually found love. They went off into the bigger adult forests. Some went one way, others went another, never to see each other again, as was their way. They became champion fighters, creator of beautiful woodworks, or great song composers. In the following seasons they would now and then occasionally wonder to themselves whatever happened to that odd little Siow. They hoped that he had eventually found his place in the forests, but they never saw him again and had no idea of his fate. After waiting a full planetary cycle of the sun, Siow now felt ready to try his luck and find a mate, having had a whole year to perfect his singing. That next courting season, Siow returned to try his luck, but was dismayed by what his ears heard as he approached the courtship ring of the forest. He was shocked at how well the others sang, and felt he could not possibly compete. Any sound he tried to make became a dry, quiet whisper in his mouth, unable to break free. All the while the other young adult Sumids sang so loud and clear, and a busy soup of sound around them, that they never even noticed poor little Siow struggling to find his voice. So he returned to the deep part of the children's forest to practice once again. The following season he came back to the courtship ring, but still felt he was not quite ready, and so promised himself that he would be ready next season for sure. But it turned out to be a little more than next season before he finally felt ready to return and try again. Finally his third attempt came, and this season, when he returned to the populated parts of the children's forest, he was once again shocked by what he found. But this time, it was not shock from his fellow singers' songcraft, but rather that his fellow singers all looked so small and odd to him. So many seasons had now passed that he no longer recognised any of the faces. All those who had struggled as he had done had either found their mate by now or had perished by this time. He looked at the new faces around him now. They were all so much younger than him. He felt quite out of place among such young and unfamiliar faces. It made him feel quite uncomfortable, coming to the realization that he was now an old face among the young Sumids, and he felt an overwhelming feeling of uncomfortable uncanniness. An adult face in the children's forest was as alien and unwelcome as the space travellers he had longed to learn more about in his youth. This place was no longer his home. He could sense it in the eyes of the strangers, those young Sumid brothers and sisters of his. They looked at him inquisitively and wondered what this strange Suman was doing here. And so Siow had no other option but to leave and never return once more to the courtship ring. He began to wander and soon found himself leaving the children's forest, travelling into the deep unknown parts of the great green expanse in search of a new home where perhaps he could find a female to sing to. And so his lonely wanderings began. Most Sumids would choose a particular patch of woods to wander for the rest of their lives, and they did so in large clans, which they would choose after completing their courtship songs and bonding with their life mate. But Siow, on the other hand, had wasted so much time fearing that he would get his courtship song wrong, that he ended up wandering alone from one patch of the forest to the next. Other Sumids, being fearful of strangers, stayed clear of him and told him to get out of their patch. A strange Suman unbonded with a female was a strange sight to most Sumids, and most often meant that something had gone horribly wrong. Some whispered to each other as they saw Siow, the unwelcome traveller, that he must have killed his mate, or that he must have been kicked out of his clan for some terrible crime. Thief, murderer, freak, monster, they hissed at him as he wandered on past them sadly. So he was forced to move on and find a more welcoming patch of forest, always hoping to find his place, his girl, and finally rest at home, content and happy. The lonely Sumid drifted on through the forest, and in time he slowly grew older and more tired of the endless search. The seasons drifted on, and Siow continued to wander. He was now much older, and he was no longer looking for a girl, but rather a woman. Then, as the seasons went on, he felt his youth rapidly slipping away, and his chances of finding love now dwindled away to almost nothing. He thought in his head over and over again how foolish he had been. He hated himself and wished he had not been the person he had been or had become. If only he had been normal, he thought to himself. Why couldn't he have just enjoyed singing the same old dull songs as everyone else? Why did he have to dream big and wish for adventures in the stars? Why couldn't he just be happy with all the normal dull stuff that Sumids were supposed to like competitive fighting or singing songs about how great his particular patch of the forest was? But it just wasn't him. It just didn't feel right. But he felt he was the only Sumid in the whole planet that felt this way. Why must I dream so big when life demands that I be so small? Why can't I just be normal and complacent like everybody else? These were some of the thoughts that constantly tormented him each day. In his midlife period, he often asked himself such questions and sang quietly to himself, mumbling of his long-laboured but never-heard courtship song. He drifted in and out of madness, sometimes softly singing sweetly of women and beautiful things. Then at other times he would ramble, half crazed by his loneliness, harsh songs of anger and disgust at his fellow Sumids, especially those of the fussy female kind. But as the seasons continued to drift away, he became an old man, and his body grew tired, and his temperament mellowed. Now his wanderings became harder, and in the cold seasons he had to rest more often in caves to keep warm. All the time as he lay shivering in the dark, echoey chambers of rock, he wished for companionship and tried to imagine what it could feel like to have another, warm body next to his as he lay there, ice cold and alone. Then, one day he woke up and felt his dream come true. He smiled, and he felt the warmth of another touch his old, cold skin. Everything seemed just right. Now that they were finally with him, at long last, his beautiful young partner, with her pretty green eyes and the lovely pointy beak. There beside her were her young hatchlings, already old enough to fend for themselves and leave the nest to join the other children in the children's forest, where he had grown up all those years ago. He smiled at his beloved partner and tried to remember her name. But in his old confused brain, he struggled to remember anything about her. Then, the more he thought about her, the more she seemed to fade away until he could no longer picture her face. It was just a bright, hazy blur now, which then seemed to fade even more until there was nothing but a bright light in her place. Then, as he opened his eyes, he felt his dream go away. He saw how bright everything looked as the sun shone right through the cave entrance onto him, softly warming his cold skin, mocking his feelings of loneliness by reminding him what it must feel like to be truly warm and loved. He felt his little weak body ache as he got up to continue his lonely wanderings. He stepped out of the cave into the sun, shining so brightly in the snow-covered forest, which looked very pretty in the stillness of the morning. Though it was sunny, it was still bitterly cold during the cold seasons, and old Siow struggled to keep his legs moving on this day, the final day of his long, lonely journey. Siow drifted through the long forgotten parts of the forest world, where the snow fell in such thickness that no other Sumid ever wished to venture into it. He had come here at last, and one final search for a welcoming hand and a place to rest for his final days. Quietly he mumbled parts of his love song as he plodded through the heavy snow-covered forests of white, still nothingness, dead and songless. His mumbling song was muffled by the snow and only echoed back to him slightly and hollowly through the bare branches of the uncaring trees. A soft, quiet tune that reached no other Summit ears other than his own. He continued to mumble to himself in an attempt to keep himself alive in the bitter cold. He drifted through those icy woods until the day became night, his song growing softer and fainter as time went on and he got tired. Then finally his little feathered feet gave way and his knees fell into the snow. He could wander no more. Exhausted, hungry and tired, it was clear to him that he wouldn't have the energy now to reach the next set of hills in search of a cave to sleep in. He had little time left as he came to the conclusion that his energy was almost spent. So he decided he would use it. Now, at long last, he was finally ready to sing his song. He began by singing of the beauty of the children's forest, which he had known well and loved dearly in his youth. He sang of the rich diversity of summer flowers, the bright shades of orange, gold, purple and pink, the warm, calming green of the fresh tree leaves, the fragrant scent of juicy ripening fruits, and succulent plants and roots which made every summit happy with warm, joyful thoughts of full bellies. Then he sang of the beautiful young girls which he had wished to court during his youth, and his song became melancholy. Long years had made these verses hard and bitter, and the absence of love had skewed his feelings for those he had wished he'd loved. But then he did what no other summit before him had ever thought of doing before. He sang about the future. He thought about how the adult summits of his younger days looked down on those travellers from another world as primitives who came to their planet to see how life was supposed to be. But he could see just how silly his own people really were. The travellers didn't look up to them. They looked down at his silly little race and pitied them, as he too pitied them now. He sung of a future which the summits could so easily achieve if only they could see the world past the point of their own beaks. If only they would stop their petty arguing about who has the best trees and fruit and who was the loudest, most musical of the clans. If they could only realise that they were capable of being so much more than simple forest dwellers. If they could stop their boastful ways and work together to form a united Sumidia, so that all summits could live in peace and could find love. Then he sang about his past regrets and wished that he had just had the courage to say hello to a female. If only summits weren't so caught up in the mad courting rituals and songs which their society demanded they take part in. If only they could talk in plain, simple words about how they truly felt about each other, rather than having to go through the laborious pressure of creating a courting song to win over a female. After his rant about summit society, he then sang about space, and of other people, other planets, and of the amazing universe which he was sure lay just beyond his world. In his long, lonely travellings, he had thought for many years about the possibilities of life beyond this dull little world, which all other summits thought was the centre of the universe and the only thing worth singing about. As the frostbite began to make him stiff and forced him to shiver uncontrollably, his little old heart raced to get his song finished. He remembered the songs of the other worlds from his childhood and added parts of those songs to his own. All of Sumidia seemed so small and silly when he sang about the giant planets he had heard about. Those that were 10 times the size of his own little world, completely made of gas, whatever that was, planets of ice and planets of volcanic fire, ancient purple seas of moons where the trees and people were made of crystal. If only he could see it for himself, he cried. Icy cold now, the little old Sumid summoned up his last store of strength and sang his weak little heart out about the wonders of the worlds beyond his own, of huge planets filled with water and strange water-living animals, far larger and frightening than those of his world. He sang of the people he had heard songs about as a child, those strange travellers from another world, who told his uninterested people about their amazing flying machines, huge cities filled with a rich diversity of aliens, and how each and every one of them had a partner to call their love. Out there, he sang, out there was sights and songs which no Sumid could ever possibly dream of. Out there, almost anything seemed possible. Worlds where no one fought each other, worlds where all people had enough to eat, worlds where no one was lonely. Out there, he dreamt he was home. His love would come flying out of the sky and rescue him from this dull, miserable little planet, with all its equally dull little people, who were content to live in blissful ignorance of the universe around them, content to think that their world was the only thing that mattered. But old Siow didn't think like that. He dreamt of life and adventure beyond the ordinary. He had become a freak, an outcast, an odd little stranger, for dreaming to think beyond the norms of Sumid society. And for this crime, he had been sentenced to a life of miserable loneliness. A self-inflicted sentence, condemned by himself, for he feared that no Sumid could ever love him due to his eccentricities. Sadly, as he was never to know about it, he was wrong about this assumption. For other Sumids had and would dare to dream as he had, but they were too scared to sing out aloud their dreams for fear of the other more traditional Sumids who held dominance over Sumid society. And so, in the dark icy corner of a previously unexplored part of the forest, the little old Sumid, Siow, sang his song with all his heart. It wasn't a mere courtship song of some silly youth, nor was it a bland, repetitive song about adulthood which said a lot about nothing. This was a song quite unique in Sumid culture. He sang about his life, but also about his world, and then he sang of what was beyond his world, and how he dreamed of those sparkling lights in the sky, and wished to see them closer. It was a song not just about some fleeting love for a girl, but a song about the love of life, of the infinite life, which bonds us all together as one single whole of our universe. As the old Sumid got near the end of his epic song of life in the cosmos, his voice became harsh and faint, and he struggled to move his stiffening beak. His song grew fainter until it was overshadowed by the gentle hull of the wind rustling the nearby trees. Unable to sing any more, Siow lay down in the snow. It felt strangely warm. He looked up at the starry night, and tears came to his eyes. There were dots of light dancing faintly above him, and beside him he felt someone warm resting beside him, someone beautiful, someone who loved him. He smiled as they watched the lights in the sky. They got brighter and the snow became warmer. He found one last ounce of strength within him, now that he was feeling warmer, and sang the final verse of his song softly to himself as the light filled his vision. He sang softly of how he would be with his love, up there in the stars, adventuring together far beyond this world. Then he fell softly back into his warm, soft bed of snow and rested for a while. His song faded and then stopped, never to be heard again. The forest was cold and dark once more, as songless as it had been and would be ever after.